The steam rose from a metal cup clutched between blackened fingers, each digit swollen with frostbite that had turned flesh the color of charcoal. Around the makeshift fire, shadows danced across faces so gaunt that cheekbones jutted like knife blades beneath skin stretched taut over skull. The acrid smoke from burning furniture mixed with the metallic tang of frozen blood that crusted in beards and nostrils. Outside the dugout, artillery shells whistled through air so cold it cracked like glass, each explosion sending tremors through earth frozen solid as concrete. In the corner, a soldier methodically scraped bark from a chair leg with his bayonet, preparing what would pass for dinner in this subterranean hell. These were not Soviet prisoners enduring Stalin's gulags. These were German soldiers, the supposed master race, reduced to scavenging like animals in the ruins of Stalingrad. Had Hitler's war machine finally found an enemy it could not conquer? Winter itself? The confident Wehrmacht soldiers who marched into Stalingrad's outskirts in August 1942 had conquered Paris, Warsaw, and Kiev. But none had prepared them for the savage intimacy of house-to-house combat, where a single apartment building could consume an entire company. Street fighting transformed the industrial city into a labyrinth of death, where German technological superiority meant nothing against Soviet defenders who fought from sewers, basements, and factory ruins with the desperation of cornered wolves. Friedrich Paulus guided his Sixth Army eastward across the boundless steppe, with the confidence of a commander who had never known defeat. At over 250,000 men strong, his army represented the largest single formation in the Wehrmacht, and one of its soldiers, Wilhelm Hoffmann, captured the prevailing mood in his diary when he wrote that they would soon reach the Volga, take Stalingrad, and then the war will be over. The endless grasslands stretched before them like a green ocean, broken only by the occasional collective farm or village, and the men marched with the swagger of conquerors who had already crushed the military might of a dozen nations. On August 23, 1942, over 1,000 aircraft of Luftwaffe 4 unleashed their fury upon the industrial city that clung to the Volga's western bank like a narrow ribbon of concrete and steel. The Junkers 88s and Heinkel 111s flew sortie after sortie through smoke-filled skies, their bomb loads transforming wooden residential districts into infernos that painted the heavens orange. General Maximilian von Weichs watched the aerial bombardment from Army Group B headquarters with the detached satisfaction of a commander who believed he was witnessing the prelude to yet another swift German victory. The flames subsided by evening, leaving behind a moonscape of rubble and twisted girders that seemed to confirm German expectations. Surely no organized resistance could emerge from such devastation. Yet as Paulus's infantry advanced into the city's outskirts, they discovered that the bombed ruins had created something far worse than empty ground. They had fashioned a fortress. Every pile of debris became a machine gun nest, every crater a mortar position, every collapsed building a labyrinth of death where Soviet defenders materialized from the shadows like vengeful ghosts. Walter Heitz, commanding the 8th Army Corps, found his veteran divisions stumbling into a nightmare they had never imagined. The blitzkrieg tactics that had swept across Europe like lightning became useless in the narrow streets where tanks could not maneuver and air support could not distinguish friend from foe. His men, who had marched across Poland in 18 days and conquered France in 6 weeks, now measured their progress in meters rather than kilometers. A single grain elevator defended by 50 Soviet soldiers held out for days against repeated assaults by an entire German regiment. its concrete walls absorbing artillery shells like a sponge, while defenders on different floors fired down at attackers through holes blasted in the structure. The Germans invented a new term for this hellish form of warfare: Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats, as they found themselves crawling through sewers, basements, and bombed-out apartments in pursuit of enemies who seemed to vanish into the very stones of the city. Buildings became vertical battlefields where German soldiers might control the ground floor while Soviets held the upper levels, the two sides separated by a few feet of concrete and the constant thunder of grenades tossed up and down stairwells. Combat occurred at such close quarters that men preferred bayonets and entrenching tools to rifles, the intimate nature of the killing stripping away all pretense of civilized warfare. Vasily Chuikov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army, had developed the crucial tactic of hugging the enemy, keeping his defenders so close to German positions that the Wehrmacht could not effectively use its superior firepower without risking their own troops. Soviet snipers became hunters who stalked German officers through the ruins, their rifles cracking like whips whenever a Feldwebel raised his head to observe enemy positions, or a lieutenant emerged from cover to rally his men. The rubble-strewn streets became killing grounds where a soldier might die simply for lighting a cigarette or sharing rations with a comrade. Artillery spotters represented the most prized targets for Soviet marksmen, as these men served as the eyes of the German war machine. When a spotter fell, entire artillery barrages would fall silent, their guns rendered blind by the loss of a single skilled observer. The psychological toll proved as devastating as the physical casualties, as German soldiers found themselves trapped in an urban maze where death could strike from any window, doorway, or pile of debris. By September, the scale of the urban warfare had expanded beyond anything previously witnessed in modern military history. The Sixth Army controlled roughly 250,000 German troops within the city itself, supported by elements of the 4th Panzer Army under Hermann Hoth. Soviet defenders numbered approximately 180,000 soldiers from the 62nd and 64th Armies, though these figures fluctuated wildly as reinforcements were fed into the meat grinder on a daily basis. Daily artillery exchanges reached 15,000 shells from both sides combined, creating a constant thunderstorm of explosions that shattered windows 50 kilometers away. The fighting consumed an average of 2,500 German and 3,200 Soviet soldiers daily, with casualty rates approaching those of the worst days at Verdun during World War I. The factory districts became the epicenter of the most savage fighting, as massive industrial complexes like the Red October Steelworks, the Barikady Arms Factory, and the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Plant were transformed into fortress-like strongholds. These concrete behemoths, built to withstand the stresses of heavy industry, proved remarkably resistant to German artillery and air attacks. Their maze-like interiors, filled with heavy machinery and metal walkways, created perfect defensive positions where a handful of Soviet soldiers could hold off entire German companies for weeks. Each factory became a microcosm of the larger battle, with fighting raging floor by floor, room by room, and machine by machine. German assault engineers, specialists trained in urban warfare, found their expertise tested to the breaking point as they attempted to clear buildings that seemed to regenerate defenders like living organisms. No sooner would they secure a workshop than Soviet soldiers would emerge from hidden tunnels or basement passages to launch desperate counterattacks that often reclaimed the same ground at terrible cost in human life. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus shattered German overconfidence as Soviet forces launched their devastating counteroffensive that would trap 250,000 German and Axis soldiers in a cauldron of ice and steel from which few would emerge alive. The carefully orchestrated pincer movement caught German commanders completely off guard, transforming hunters into hunted as Stalin's armies closed the ring around Stalingrad with the methodical precision of a strangling serpent. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had spent the autumn months orchestrating the most ambitious deception in military history, moving over 1 million Soviet troops into position while German intelligence remained blind to the gathering storm. From his headquarters in Moscow, the architect of victory coordinated 3 separate fronts with the precision of a conductor directing a symphony of destruction. Nikolai Vatutin commanded the southwestern front with 3 complete armies totaling 18 infantry divisions, 8 tank brigades, 2 motorized brigades, 6 cavalry divisions, and 1 anti-tank brigade. Konstantin Rokossovsky led the Don Front with 4 armies positioned to strike from the north, while Andrei Yeremenko's Stalingrad front prepared to deliver the southern blow that would seal the German fate. The weather itself seemed to conspire against the Axis forces, as freezing rain and hard frosts made reinforcement impossible while concealing the massive Soviet buildup. Thick fog blanketed the Don River Valley on the morning of November 19th, creating perfect conditions for the surprise attack that would change the course of the war. Romanian sentries huddled in their shallow trenches could hear the rumbling of motors and the neighing of horses in the crisp air. But the sound seemed distant and unthreatening to men who had been assured by German commanders that the Soviets lacked the strength for major offensive operations. At precisely 7:20 a.m., Soviet artillery batteries unleashed a barrage that transformed the Romanian defensive positions into a moonscape of shattered earth and twisted metal. For 80 minutes, 5,888 artillery pieces and thousands of Katyusha rocket launchers pounded the 3rd Romanian Army's positions with an intensity that exceeded anything witnessed since Verdun. The poorly equipped Romanian soldiers, many lacking proper winter clothing and modern anti-tank weapons, cowered in trenches that offered little protection against the steel hurricane falling from the sky. General Petre Dumitrescu's 3rd Romanian Army stretched across 138 kilometers of front with only 492 Romanian troops and 11,211 German troops faced an impossible task. Each Romanian division defended approximately 20 kilometers of front, twice the recommended distance, while facing Soviet forces that outnumbered them by more than 3-1. The Germans had ignored Dumitrescu's repeated warnings about Soviet bridgeheads at Serafimovich and Kletskaya, dismissing them as insignificant when they represented the launching points for the avalanche that was about to destroy the entire Axis southern flank. When the Soviet infantry and armor surged forward through the morning fog, the Romanian resistance crumbled like sand before a tidal wave. The 5th Tank Army smashed through the positions of the 14th Infantry Division, while the 21st Army struck the junction between the 13th Infantry Division and the 1st Cavalry Division with devastating effect. Romanian soldiers found themselves facing T-34 tanks that their obsolete anti-tank guns could not penetrate, while Soviet infantry armed with submachine guns advanced in human waves that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. By evening on November 19th, the 3rd Romanian Army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Soviet armored spearheads had advanced 70 kilometers through the shattered defensive line, racing toward the Don River crossings that would cut off the German 6th Army from its supply lines. The 22nd Panzer Division, Germany's mobile reserve, found itself overwhelmed by the sheer number of Soviet tanks at Petcheny and withdrew northward in disorder, leaving the Romanian 1st Armored Division isolated and fighting for survival against impossible odds. The southern hammer blow fell on November 20th, as Yeremenko's forces struck the 4th Romanian Army with equal ferocity. General Constantin Constantinescu's 75,580 men found themselves facing another carefully coordinated assault that pulverized their defensive positions within hours. The Romanian forces, consisting primarily of infantry with minimal anti-tank weapons, were overrun by large numbers of T-34s and KV-1 heavy tanks that rolled through their lines like steel avalanches, crushing everything in their path. The 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions of the 4th Romanian Army were virtually destroyed by evening on November 20th, their shattered remnants streaming southward in panic, while Soviet mechanized corps raced westward to complete the encirclement. The 18th Infantry Division found itself in danger of complete annihilation as Soviet forces broke through at Tundutovo and Ivanovka, getting behind the Romanian positions and trapping thousands of soldiers who had nowhere to retreat. Paulus received the first reports of the Romanian collapse with disbelief that quickly transformed into horror as the magnitude of the disaster became apparent. His headquarters at Golubinskaya buzzed with frantic radio traffic as staff officers tried to make sense of contradictory reports flooding in from collapsing front lines. The 6th Army commander found himself facing a nightmare scenario that German war plans had never seriously considered: the complete collapse of both flanks simultaneously, leaving his entire army exposed to encirclement deep inside enemy territory. Hitler's response to the crisis demonstrated the same detachment from reality that had characterized his conduct of the entire Russian campaign. From his headquarters at Rostenburg, the Führer ordered all offensive operations in Stalingrad to cease while directing Paulus to detach 2 motorized formations, an infantry division, and all available anti-tank units to stop Vatutin's and Rokossovsky's advancing forces. These measures might have blunted a limited Soviet probe, but they were utterly inadequate against a carefully planned operation involving over 1 million men and 900 tanks. On November 23rd, the 2 Soviet pincers met near the village of Sovetsky, approximately 16 kilometers southeast of Kalash. The forward elements of the 36th Mechanized Brigade from Yeremenko's 4th Mechanized Corps sighted the approaching tanks of the 45th Tank Brigade from Vatutin's 4th Tank Corps at 4:00 p.m. At first, the Soviet crews mistook each other for Germans because the agreed recognition signals were not fired, leading to several tanks being damaged in a brief exchange of fire before the link-up was confirmed and celebrated for newsreel cameras. The closing of the ring sealed the fate of approximately 290,000 Axis personnel, including the entire German 6th Army, elements of the 4th Panzer Army, and the surviving remnants of 2 Romanian armies. The steel noose that Zhukov had crafted with mathematical precision now held the largest concentration of German military power ever trapped by enemy forces, creating a cauldron that would consume Hitler's most experienced divisions and finest soldiers. Operation Uranus had achieved in 4 days what Soviet commanders had thought would take weeks. The Southwestern Front advanced 40 kilometers from their bridgeheads, Don Front forces pushed 30 kilometers southward, and the Stalingrad Front drove 50 kilometers westward to complete the encirclement. Over 65,000 Romanian soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured in the opening phase of the offensive, with the 3rd and 4th Armies losing 70% of their combat strength. German losses reached 25 summer men in the first 96 hours, while Soviet casualties totaled approximately 85,000 killed and wounded, a price Stalin considered acceptable for destroying the Wehrmacht's offensive capability on the Eastern Front. The Romanian collapse had torn a gap 200 kilometers wide in the Axis front, through which Soviet mechanized forces poured like water through a broken dam. The disaster effectively ended Romanian offensive capability for the remainder of the war, as Marshal Ion Antonescu later admitted that after the defeat of the Third and Fourth Armies near Stalingrad, the very foundations of the Romanian government were shaken. The desire to end the war as soon as possible became common among all Romanians, marking the beginning of the end for Hitler's most important ally in southeastern Europe. As winter's first bite turned soil into impenetrable stone, German soldiers discovered that survival meant becoming human moles, clawing bunkers and trenches from earth so frozen that pickaxes shattered like glass against its surface. These improvised fortifications became elaborate underground cities where men lived like medieval peasants, burning furniture and books for warmth while Soviet shells pounded the surface above into moonscape desolation. The first killing frost arrived on November 27, 1942, transforming the battlefield into a crystalline wasteland where temperatures plunged to -25 degrees Celsius and continued their relentless descent toward the depths of the Russian winter. German soldiers who had expected to be celebrating Christmas victory parades in warm German cities found themselves wielding entrenching tools against earth that rang like iron beneath their blows. The frozen ground defeated their standard digging techniques, forcing them to use explosives and fires to soften the permafrost before they could excavate even the most basic protective positions. The balkas, or ravines that scarred the steppe around Stalingrad, became lifelines for survival as German soldiers discovered that these natural depressions offered the only practical locations for creating shelter. Infantry companies carved elaborate accommodations into the steep clay walls of these ravines, creating networks of caves and dugouts that honeycombed the frozen earth like termite mounds. The balkas provided protection from the howling winds that swept across the open steppe, while their steep sides offered some defense against Soviet artillery observers who prowled the battlefield with their deadly accurate fire missions. German engineers adapted construction techniques from the Great War to create bunker systems that could withstand both the brutal climate and constant bombardment. The most sophisticated positions featured multiple levels connected by wooden stairs and communication tunnels that allowed men to move between firing positions without exposing themselves to sniper fire or shell fragments. Oil drums salvaged from destroyed vehicles became the foundation for heating systems that burned anything combustible, from broken furniture stripped from Stalingrad houses to books and papers torn from German military manuals whose tactical wisdom had proven worthless in this frozen hell. The construction of these subterranean fortresses required enormous effort from men who were already weakened by inadequate rations and constant combat stress. German soldiers worked in shifts around the clock, using bayonets, mess tins, and bare hands to expand their underground warren, one spadeful of frozen earth at a time. Many positions extended 20 feet below ground level, deep enough to provide protection from even heavy Soviet artillery, while ventilation shafts, disguised as innocent piles of rubble, allowed fresh air to circulate through the cramped living spaces below. The heating systems became marvels of desperate ingenuity as German soldiers learned to create warmth from the most unlikely materials. Aircraft parts scavenged from crashed Luftwaffe planes were fashioned into crude but effective stoves, while wooden furniture taken from destroyed civilian homes provided fuel that burned with aromatic smoke that reminded the soldiers of peacetime hearths. Some bunkers featured elaborate chimney systems that vented smoke through multiple concealed openings to avoid detection by Soviet observers, while others relied on simple braziers that filled the underground chambers with choking fumes that men endured rather than freeze to death in the open air. The underground cities developed their own primitive infrastructure as German military discipline adapted to the requirements of subterranean warfare. Communication trenches connected individual bunker systems to create networks that allowed platoon and company commanders to maintain contact with their scattered units without exposing runners to the constant danger of Soviet snipers. These tunnels, carved through frozen earth with the persistence of medieval miners, became highways for the movement of supplies, ammunition, and wounded soldiers who could be evacuated from forward positions without crossing the killing zones that separated German lines from Soviet observation posts. The cramped living conditions in these underground shelters tested the limits of human endurance as men who had once enjoyed the spacious barracks of peacetime Germany found themselves packed into spaces barely large enough for sleeping. Soldiers learned to sleep in shifts, with some men resting while others maintained watch or worked to expand their subterranean domain. The constant dampness from human breath and body heat created a perpetual fog inside the bunkers, while the lack of proper sanitation led to conditions that would have horrified peacetime military inspectors, but seemed luxurious compared to the alternative of freezing to death on the surface. Personal hygiene became impossible in these underground layers, where water froze solid within minutes of being brought below ground, and washing required melting ice or snow over the precious fires that provided the only source of warmth. German soldiers developed a distinctive odor that combined unwashed human bodies with wood smoke and the metallic tang of frozen earth, creating a stench that marked them as inhabitants of this underground world, even when they briefly emerged into the open air. By December 1942, German forces had constructed over 2,000 individual bunker positions across a 40-kilometer perimeter around Stalingrad. These ranged from simple one-man rifle pits scraped into the frozen ground to elaborate company-sized complexes that housed up to 150 men in interconnected chambers and tunnels. The largest installations featured multiple entrances and exits, ammunition storage areas carved into the earth, and even primitive medical stations where company medics treated frostbite and wounds by the light of flickering candles or oil lamps. Construction consumed an estimated 50,000 man-hours daily, with German soldiers spending more time digging than fighting as they raced to create shelter before the full fury of the Russian winter descended upon them. The deepest bunkers extended 6 meters underground, requiring the excavation of approximately 200 cubic meters of frozen earth per position, while the tunnel networks connecting these positions totaled over 300 kilometers in length by the end of December. The makeshift heating systems consumed enormous quantities of fuel, as German soldiers burned an estimated 500 tons of scavenged wood daily in their desperate attempts to maintain survivable temperatures in their underground shelters. Furniture, doors, window frames, and even wooden ammunition boxes disappeared into the insatiable maws of the improvised stoves that provided the only barrier between life and death in the frozen wasteland. Some of the more elaborate heating systems were created from aircraft engines salvaged from crashed Luftwaffe planes, their aluminum construction providing excellent heat distribution, while their original fuel systems were adapted to burn anything combustible. The psychological impact of this subterranean existence proved as devastating as the physical hardships. As German soldiers accustomed to the mobile warfare that had conquered most of Europe found themselves transformed into creatures of the underground who emerged only when duty absolutely demanded it. The claustrophobic bunkers became both sanctuary and prison, offering protection from Soviet fire, while trapping men in spaces so confining that many developed what medical officers diagnosed as acute anxiety reactions that manifested in trembling, hyperventilation, and an overwhelming desire to flee into the open air, even when such exposure meant certain death. The bunker networks became the nervous system of German resistance, as telephone lines were strung through the tunnel systems to maintain communication between isolated units and their command posts. German signalmen worked constantly to maintain these vital links, splicing broken wires and rerouting communications through alternate paths when Soviet artillery severed the cables that carried orders and reports through the underground maze. Radio communication proved unreliable in the underground chambers, forcing commanders to rely on runners who navigated the tunnel systems with maps drawn on scraps of paper and illuminated their way with candles that cast dancing shadows on the frozen earth walls. The acoustic properties of these underground systems created an eerie soundscape where the muffled explosions of Soviet artillery bombardments mixed with the scraping of entrenching tools, the whispered conversations of soldiers huddled around their fires, and the constant dripping of condensation that froze into icicles hanging from tunnel ceilings. German soldiers learned to interpret the sounds of battle filtered through layers of earth and timber, distinguishing between the impacts of different types of Soviet weapons by the vibrations they transmitted through the frozen ground into the underground chambers, where men waited for the bombardments to end so they could emerge to fight another day. The Luftwaffe's promised airlift delivered death instead of salvation, dropping supplies into Soviet hands, while German soldiers gnawed leather boots and boiled wallpaper paste for sustenance. Hunger became a living entity that stalked the trenches, transforming proud soldiers into skeletal specters who fought over scraps of horse meat with the ferocity of wild animals defending their last meal. Hermann Göring's grandiose promises to supply the encircled Sixth Army by air crumbled into bitter mockery as the reality of winter warfare in the frozen steppe exposed the hollow boasts of Nazi leadership. The Reichsmarschall had assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could deliver 500 tons of supplies daily to the trapped forces, but the most optimistic estimates from experienced transport commanders had never exceeded 350 tons per day under ideal conditions. The reality proved catastrophically different as German transport planes struggled to deliver even 100 tons daily into the shrinking cauldron where 250,000 men waited for salvation that would never come. The first supply flights began on November 24, 1942, with 22 of 47 Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft managing to reach Stalingrad through the gauntlet of Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The remaining 25 planes were either shot down, forced to turn back due to weather, or crashed, attempting to land on the improvised airfields within the pocket. This dismal performance set the tone for an operation that would consume hundreds of aircraft and thousands of aircrew, while delivering a fraction of the supplies needed to sustain human life in the frozen hellscape of Stalingrad. The transport planes that did manage to penetrate Soviet defenses carried ammunition and fuel for the Luftwaffe fighters defending the airfields rather than food for the starving soldiers. Military priorities demanded that aircraft fuel receive precedence over human sustenance, creating the grotesque situation where German soldiers watched precious cargo planes unload aviation gasoline, while their own rations were cut to starvation levels. The bitter irony was not lost on men who understood they were being sacrificed to maintain the illusion that aerial supply could substitute for proper logistics. By December 1942, the daily airlift averaged only 117 tons, less than 1/5 of the minimum requirement, while weather conditions and Soviet interference reduced some days to 0 deliveries. German soldiers watched the skies desperately for the distant drone of Ju-52 engines, knowing that each aircraft represented the difference between another day of life and slow death by starvation. When planes did appear, men emerged from their bunkers like scarecrows wrapped in rags, their hollow eyes reflecting the terrible mathematics of survival, where a single loaf of bread might mean life for one man and death for 4 others. The progressive reduction of rations told the story of the airlift's failure in stark numerical terms that no propaganda could obscure. German soldiers initially received 400 grams of bread per day, then 200 grams by early December, and finally 75 grams by Christmas 1942. This single slice of bread often represented the only food available to men who were expected to fight against an enemy that grew stronger each day while they grew weaker. The psychological impact of watching their bodies consume themselves was as devastating as any Soviet attack, as proud Wehrmacht soldiers came to resemble the concentration camp inmates they had helped create. The slaughter of the army's horses provided temporary relief from starvation, while marking another milestone in the descent toward complete collapse. The Sixth Army had entered the battle with 25,000 horses, magnificent animals that had pulled artillery, carried supplies, and served as symbols of military might across the conquered territories of Europe. Now these same horses became meat rations distributed among desperate men who carved steaks from frozen carcasses with their bayonets and ate the flesh raw when no fuel existed to cook it properly. When the last horses were consumed, German soldiers turned to hunting rats, cats, dogs, and anything else that moved through the ruins of Stalingrad. The proud conquerors of Paris and Warsaw found themselves competing with vermin for scraps of food, setting traps for rats with the same methodical attention to detail they had once applied to military tactics. Cats became prized delicacies that soldiers pursued through bombed-out buildings with the intensity of big game hunters, while dogs were killed and butchered before their owners could interfere. The hunger drove men to behaviors that would have horrified their peacetime selves, as German soldiers learned to identify which parts of leather equipment could be boiled into edible paste, and which wallpaper adhesives might contain enough nutrition to sustain life for another day. Boot leather became a valuable commodity that men traded for other survival items, while belts and holsters were carefully cut into strips and boiled into gelatinous soups that provided the illusion of substance, if not actual nutrition. Wilhelm Hoffmann captured the horror of Christmas 1942 in his diary when he wrote that, "The horses have already been eaten. I would eat a cat. They say its meat is tasty. The soldiers look like corpses or lunatics. They no longer take cover from Russian shells. They haven't the strength to walk, run away, and hide." His words revealed the complete breakdown of military discipline, as starvation reduced fighting men to shambling skeletons who lacked the energy to seek shelter from enemy fire. The medical consequences of prolonged starvation manifested in ways that military doctrine had never contemplated, as German soldiers developed the distinctive appearance of famine victims with sunken cheeks, protruding ribs, and eyes that seemed too large for their shrunken faces. Men who had once prided themselves on their physical conditioning became walking skeletons whose uniforms hung loose on frames that had lost 30 or 40 pounds in a matter of weeks. The cold compounded the effects of malnutrition, as bodies lacking adequate calories could not generate enough heat to prevent frostbite even in relatively mild temperatures. By January 1943, the Luftwaffe's transport capability had effectively collapsed under the combined pressure of Soviet air defenses, winter weather, and the loss of forward airfields to Soviet advances. Daily supply deliveries averaged only 60 tons, barely enough to feed a single battalion for one day, while the pocket contained the equivalent of 20 divisions. The mathematical impossibility of the situation became apparent even to the most optimistic German commanders. Yet Hitler continued to forbid any discussion of surrender or breakout attempts. The airlift operation consumed over 500 aircraft and 1,000 aircrew members in a futile attempt to sustain the unsustainable, representing the destruction of an entire air force for no strategic gain. German transport pilots flew mission after mission into the cauldron, watching their comrades die in flaming aircraft while delivering supplies that represented drops in an ocean of need. The Luftwaffe's training programs shut down entirely as instructors and students were sent to the Russian front, ensuring that even if the transport planes had succeeded in saving the Sixth Army, the German Air Force lacked the personnel to train replacements for its mounting losses. The total supplies delivered by air reached 8,350 tons over 72 days of operation, an average of 116 tons per day compared to the minimum requirement of 300 tons. Soviet forces captured approximately 1,200 tons of supplies intended for German forces, while weather and accidents accounted for the loss of another 2,000 tons before they could reach their destination. The operation required 24,000 sorties to deliver what should have been accomplished, with 2,400 flights under normal logistics conditions, representing a tenfold decrease in efficiency that consumed irreplaceable aircraft and crews for minimal results. The complete failure of aerial resupply created a feedback loop of despair as German soldiers realized that their own leadership had abandoned them to die for political reasons rather than military necessity. Men who had trusted in German efficiency and organization discovered that their survival depended on promises made by leaders who had no understanding of the conditions inside the pocket. The psychological impact of this betrayal proved as deadly as Soviet bullets, as soldiers lost the will to fight for a cause that had clearly lost all connection to reality or basic human decency. German medics performed surgery by candlelight in sub-zero conditions, sawing through frostbitten limbs with tools so cold they burned skin on contact, while patients screamed through leather belts clenched between teeth. The wounded lay in rows like cordwood, their bandages freezing to wounds that refused to heal in temperatures that killed infection and flesh with equal efficiency. The field hospitals of the Sixth Army became charnel houses where the most fundamental principles of medical care collapsed under the weight of impossible circumstances. German physicians who had trained in the finest medical schools of Europe found themselves practicing a primitive form of surgery that would have horrified their medieval predecessors. The complete absence of anesthetics forced doctors to perform amputations on conscious patients whose agonized screams echoed through the underground bunkers that served as operating theaters. Medical supplies that had been carefully stockpiled for the advance to the Caucasus were either destroyed in the encirclement or consumed during the first weeks of the siege, leaving German doctors with nothing but their instruments and whatever improvisations they could devise from scavenged materials. Surgical bandages froze solid within minutes of application, creating rigid casts that had to be thawed with body heat before they could be adjusted or replaced. The antiseptics that prevented infection in normal conditions proved useless in the frozen environment, where even the strongest disinfectants turned into useless ice crystals. The makeshift operating rooms, carved from the earth and heated by oil drums burning furniture and paper, created an atmosphere that was simultaneously stifling and freezing. Surgeons worked by the light of candles and oil lamps while their breath formed clouds that obscured their vision, and their instruments became so cold they left frostburns on any skin they touched. The primitive conditions transformed every medical procedure into an ordeal that tested the limits of human endurance for both doctor and patient. Frostbite cases overwhelmed the medical facilities as German soldiers arrived at aid stations with limbs frozen solid as blocks of ice. Their extremities turned black with necrosis that crept up arms and legs like some malevolent tide. The standard treatment for severe frostbite required immediate amputation to prevent gangrene from spreading to vital organs. But the lack of proper surgical facilities meant that many amputations were performed with whatever cutting tools were available, including axes and saws salvaged from destroyed buildings. The psychological trauma of performing such primitive surgery affected German medical personnel as profoundly as it did their patients, as doctors trained in scientific medicine found themselves reduced to the level of battlefield butchers who cut off limbs with the same tools used to chop firewood. The screams of patients undergoing amputation without anesthesia became so common that medical orderlies developed a practiced indifference to human suffering that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The triage system that normally governed battlefield medicine broke down entirely as the number of casualties exceeded any rational capacity for treatment. German doctors were forced to abandon their Hippocratic oath and make brutal decisions about which patients might survive and which should be left to die without treatment. Men with head wounds, chest trauma, or severe burns were simply moved to a corner where they were allowed to expire quietly, while medical resources were concentrated on soldiers who might potentially return to combat. The frozen conditions created medical challenges that no textbook had ever addressed, as standard treatments became impossible when water froze, before it could be used for cleaning wounds and medications turned solid in their containers. German physicians improvised solutions by melting snow in mess tins held over candle flames, creating sterile water one precious cup at a time, while wounded soldiers waited in agony for treatment that might never come. The shortage of medical personnel compounded the crisis as German doctors and medics succumbed to the same conditions that afflicted their patients. Frostbite claimed the fingers and toes of medical staff who tried to perform delicate surgical procedures with numbed hands, while malnutrition and exhaustion reduced even the most experienced physicians to hollow-eyed scarecrows who could barely maintain their own health, much less that of their patients. Paulus reported to Hitler on January 24, 1943, that 18,000 wounded soldiers lay without the slightest aid of bandages and medicines, a statement that captured the complete collapse of medical care within the pocket. These men had been reduced to the status of living corpses, lying in rows in underground chambers where their wounds festered and their strength ebbed away 1 degree at a time as the freezing air sucked the life from their bodies. The medical statistics from the Stalingrad pocket revealed the catastrophic breakdown of German military medicine under extreme conditions. Over 14,000 soldiers required amputations due to severe frostbite, with most procedures performed without anesthesia using improvised cutting tools. Medical mortality rates reached 80% for serious injuries that would have had survival rates of 60% under normal conditions. The wounded to killed ratio, normally 3-to-1 in conventional warfare, reversed to 1-to-3 as medical care became so primitive that wounded soldiers had little chance of survival. By January 1943, Fewer than 200 trained medical personnel remained operational out of an original medical corps of over 1,500 doctors, nurses, and medics. The complete absence of medical supplies meant that 95% of wounds went untreated, except for basic bandaging, while gangrene and sepsis claimed more lives than enemy action during the final weeks of the siege. The wounded became a burden that the shrinking German perimeter could not sustain, as every injured soldier required food, shelter, and care that could not be provided by an army that was itself dying by degrees. The traditional military obligation to care for the wounded came into direct conflict with the imperative of survival, creating moral dilemmas that shattered the bonds of military brotherhood and reduced men to the most primitive calculations of resource allocation. The evacuation of wounded personnel by air became a cynical charade, as Luftwaffe pilots were ordered to prioritize officers and specialists over ordinary soldiers, leaving thousands of enlisted men to die in the frozen bunkers while their commanders escaped to safety. The few wounded soldiers who did manage to secure seats on outbound aircraft often died during the flight, as their injuries, untreated for weeks, proved fatal once they were exposed to the stress of air travel at high altitude in unpressurized cargo holds. The psychological impact of witnessing such massive medical failure created a form of trauma that extended far beyond physical wounds, as German soldiers realized that injury meant almost certain death, in conditions where even minor cuts could become fatal infections. The knowledge that medical care was essentially non-existent transformed every soldier into a potential victim of the most trivial accidents, creating a pervasive atmosphere of dread that undermined morale more effectively than any Soviet propaganda campaign. The primitive medical conditions in the Stalingrad pocket represented the complete breakdown of one of the Wehrmacht's most sophisticated support systems, demonstrating how quickly modern military medicine could revert to medieval barbarism when supply lines failed and environmental conditions exceeded human tolerance. The German army, that had prided itself on scientific efficiency, found itself practicing a form of medicine that differed little from the battlefield surgery of the Napoleonic Wars, except that the tools were duller and the patients were already half dead from starvation and cold before treatment even began. German soldiers wrote their final letters by candlelight in frozen bunkers, their numbed fingers struggling to grip pencils that snapped in the bitter cold while they composed last words to families they would never see again. These farewell messages, intended as final communications with loved ones, became instead testimonies to the complete collapse of human hope, preserved in the archives of the doomed. Private Erich Spiegler of the 297th Infantry Division wrote to his beloved Tony in Vienna on Christmas Eve 1942, his words carrying the weight of certainty that death awaited him in the frozen ruins. His letter began with gratitude for receiving 4 letters from home after weeks of postal silence, expressing joy that mail service had temporarily resumed while acknowledging that his own message might never reach its destination. The simple act of writing became an exercise in faith rather than communication, as German soldiers poured their hearts onto paper that might never leave the battlefield. The final letters revealed the progressive psychological disintegration of men who had once marched confidently across Europe as conquerors, but now found themselves reduced to scavenging for survival in conditions that defied human endurance. Soldier Otto Zechtig of the 100th Light Infantry Division described to Hedy Kaminskaya how he had butchered 4 dogs for meat while his comrades remained perpetually hungry, his matter-of-fact tone masking the desperation that drove proud German warriors to compete with stray animals for sustenance. The casual mention of hunting magpies and cooking them over makeshift fires illustrated how completely the Wehrmacht's logistical system had collapsed. The correspondence captured the transformation of military discipline into raw survival instinct, as soldiers described scenes that would have been unthinkable during the victorious campaigns of 1940 and 1941. Private First Class Walter Opperman compared Stalingrad to Verdun in a letter to his brother, noting that daily attacks gained only 20 meters before Russian counterattacks drove them back to their starting positions, creating a cycle of futile violence that consumed lives without achieving any meaningful objective. The comparison to the bloodiest battle of the First World War revealed how completely the German army had abandoned its revolutionary blitzkrieg tactics in favor of the same attritional warfare that had destroyed a previous generation. Senior Lance Corporal Joseph Simak wrote to his parents that companies which should have numbered 120 men now fielded barely 30 soldiers, describing Stalingrad as the graveyard of the German army, where cemeteries multiplied faster than victories. His assessment captured the mathematical certainty of destruction, as unit strength dissolved at a rate that made tactical planning impossible and strategic objectives meaningless. The simple arithmetic of attrition had reduced elite divisions to skeletal formations, incapable of offensive operations. The letters documented the complete breakdown of medical care and military support systems that had previously distinguished the Wehrmacht from less sophisticated armies. Heinrich Malkus reported that a company of 140 soldiers had been reduced to 16 survivors after 2 weeks of fighting, with all officers killed and non-commissioned officers forced to assume command responsibilities for which they lacked training or authority. The collapse of the officer corps created a crisis of leadership that compounded the material shortages and environmental challenges facing the trapped army. The psychological impact of prolonged siege warfare emerged through descriptions of soldiers who no longer sought shelter from Russian artillery because they lacked the energy to run for cover when shells exploded around their positions. Wilhelm Hoffmann noted in his diary that men looked like corpses or lunatics, their physical deterioration matched by mental collapse that rendered them indifferent to immediate threats. The breakdown of survival instincts marked the final stage of military disintegration, as soldiers lost the will to preserve their own lives. The Christmas season of 1942 transformed the traditional celebration of hope into a macabre farewell ceremony, where German soldiers acknowledged their impending deaths while attempting to maintain human dignity in inhuman circumstances. Kurt Reuber, a Protestant pastor and staff physician with the 16th Panzer Division, spent weeks creating a charcoal drawing of the Madonna and Child on the back of a captured Soviet map, inscribing the words "Light, Life, Love" alongside "Christmas in the Kettle, 1942" and "Fortress Stalingrad" as his contribution to the spiritual welfare of dying men. Reuber's underground bunker became an improvised chapel where German soldiers gathered to contemplate the Madonna drawing that dominated the clay wall of their subterranean refuge. When he opened the Christmas door of the bunker for the holiday celebration, soldiers stood transfixed before the image, reading the inscribed words with the reverence of men who understood they were participating in their final Christmas observance. The drawing provided a focal point for meditation and prayer in conditions where conventional religious observance had become impossible. The mail collection system that preserved these final letters represented one of the most cynical aspects of German military administration. As postal censors intercepted correspondence not to deliver it to families, but to assess troop morale for intelligence purposes, The German High Command used these intimate communications as data points for measuring the psychological state of the trapped army, treating private expressions of love and despair as military intelligence rather than human documents deserving respect and delivery. The final letters from Stalingrad comprised 39 documented communications that were never delivered to their intended recipients, but were instead archived by military censors who analyzed them for intelligence value. These letters represented final communications from soldiers in 22 divisions and 160 separate units, totaling 330,000 men trapped within the Soviet encirclement. Over 1,000 wounded soldiers arrived at field hospitals daily during the peak fighting, while company strength averaged only 30 men from authorized establishments of 120 soldiers. The postal system that intercepted these letters processed an estimated 50,000 pieces of mail monthly before the complete breakdown of communication links, with less than 10% reaching German families during the siege period. The correspondence revealed the progressive abandonment of military objectives in favor of simple survival, as soldiers wrote about killing horses, dogs, and any available animals for food, while German supply aircraft delivered an average of only 117 tons of supplies daily instead of the required 300 tons. Officer FP of the 212th Regiment recorded in his diary that division cemeteries contained over 1,000 graves by January 1943, with soldiers transferred from transport units to infantry formations facing virtual death sentences due to their lack of combat training and the impossibility of integrating replacements into existing defensive positions. The letters captured the final weeks of German resistance as writers acknowledged that escape from the pocket was impossible and relief unlikely, with many expressing the wish that Hitler would personally rescue them while simultaneously understanding that no such intervention would occur. The fatalistic acceptance of death contrasted sharply with earlier German military correspondence that had emphasized confidence in ultimate victory and faith in superior German military capabilities that would overcome any temporary setbacks. Ruber's Madonna became a symbol of hope transcending national boundaries when it was evacuated from Stalingrad on one of the last transport flights by Dr. Wilhelm Grosse, his battalion commander, who carried the drawing to safety while Ruber remained behind to face capture and death in Soviet prison camps. The image survived the destruction of the Sixth Army to become a testament to human dignity, maintained under impossible circumstances, eventually finding its home in the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church in Berlin, where it stands alongside a cross of nails from Coventry Cathedral as a symbol of reconciliation between former enemies. The final letters from Stalingrad represented the death throes of the Wehrmacht's Eastern Offensive, capturing in intimate detail the transformation of history's most successful military machine into a collection of starving, desperate men, writing farewell messages that would never reach their intended destinations, but would instead become historical documents preserving the voices of soldiers who died far from home in a war they could no longer understand or justify. German soldiers had become living corpses, their skeletal frames wrapped in frozen rags as they shambled through the ruins of Stalingrad like apparitions from some medieval plague, their sunken eyes reflecting the death that had already claimed their souls, while their bodies continued their futile struggle against the inevitable. The proud Wehrmacht that had conquered Poland in weeks and France in months was reduced to a mob of starving scarecrows who could no longer lift their weapons or dig defensive positions because their muscles had consumed themselves for fuel. The physical deterioration of the Sixth Army reached levels that defied medical understanding, as German doctors discovered through autopsies that soldiers were dying when their body fat content approached zero. A finding so elementary that it embarrassed physicians who had trained in Europe's finest medical schools. Men who had marched into Russia as representatives of the master race now weighed less than concentration camp inmates, their uniforms hanging like burial shrouds on frames that resembled anatomy skeletons more than living human beings. Typhus swept through the German ranks like a medieval scourge, carried by lice that swarmed over unwashed bodies in such numbers that medical orderlies could see masses of gray parasites crawling from one patient to another during bandage changes. When a soldier died, the lice abandoned his cooling corpse en masse, flowing like a living tide toward any nearby source of warmth and blood, creating a grotesque spectacle that horrified even hardened combat veterans who had witnessed years of warfare's brutality. The complete breakdown of sanitation and medical care created conditions that would have been familiar to soldiers of the Napoleonic Wars, as German troops suffered from dysentery, jaundice, and tuberculosis in underground bunkers where human waste froze solid and accumulated in corners because soldiers lacked the strength to dispose of it properly. The green-yellow tinge of jaundice marked faces throughout the pocket, giving the surviving Germans an otherworldly appearance that made them resemble plague victims more than soldiers of a modern army. Delousing became impossible as soap, hot water, and clean clothing disappeared from the pocket, forcing German soldiers to endure infestations that drove men to scratch their skin raw, while parasites fed on their already depleted blood supplies. Medical orderlies reported finding toes and fingers that had simply fallen off during bandage changes, separating from frostbitten extremities with such ease that they remained stuck to the filthy cloth wrappings when dressings were removed. The psychological disintegration matched the physical collapse as German officers began committing suicide rather than face capture, or continue witnessing the destruction of their commands. General Stempel, commander of the 371st Infantry Division, shot himself in the head as Soviet forces overran his positions along the Tsaritsa River, choosing death over the humiliation of surrender or the responsibility of leading his remaining soldiers into captivity. General von Hartmann of the 71st Infantry Division stood upright on a railroad embankment and fired systematically into Soviet lines until enemy bullets cut him down, his deliberate self-destruction representing the final breakdown of military rationality in commanders who could no longer bear the weight of impossible circumstances. The epidemic of officer suicides reflected not cowardice, but the complete collapse of any meaningful purpose for continued resistance. The survivors who remained functional enough to maintain guard duty often froze to death at their posts, standing like macabre sentinels until their comrades discovered them the following morning as ice-covered statues still gripping their weapons. The human body's failure to generate sufficient heat for survival created scenes of soldiers who died in place while performing their duties, their corpses remaining upright until discovered hours later by patrol groups. Rumors of cannibalism spread through the pocket as starving soldiers began eyeing the flesh of their dead comrades with desperate hunger that overcame traditional taboos against consuming human remains. While documented cases remained rare, the simple existence of such rumors revealed the complete breakdown of civilized behavior among troops who had been reduced to their most primitive survival instincts. The walking wounded represented perhaps the most pitiful aspect of the German collapse, as soldiers with untreated injuries continued to participate in combat operations because medical facilities no longer existed and evacuation was impossible. Men with infected wounds, broken bones, and untreated frostbite forced themselves to remain mobile because stopping meant certain death in conditions where rest equaled freezing and inactivity meant abandonment. The final collapse accelerated when Soviet forces split the pocket into northern and southern sections, severing communication between different elements of the Sixth Army and forcing individual units to make their own decisions about surrender or continued resistance. The fragmentation of command structure created chaos as colonels and majors found themselves commanding multi-unit formations, while generals lost contact with their subordinates and strategic coordination became impossible. Medical orderlies changing bandages discovered gray masses of lice crawling from patients onto their own arms and bodies as parasites sought new hosts among the living. By January 1943, over 100,000 German soldiers were crowded into Stalingrad's ruins, with typhus claiming 1,500 casualties weekly during epidemic peaks. Disease mortality exceeded combat deaths by a ratio of 3-to-1, as dysentery, jaundice, and tuberculosis ravaged troops whose weakened immune systems could no longer resist infection. German physicians documented that 80% of remaining soldiers showed symptoms of severe malnutrition, while 60% suffered from frostbite, ranging from minor tissue damage to complete loss of extremities. The walking wounded comprised 45% of effective strength, forcing men with untreated injuries to continue combat operations because medical evacuation had become impossible. The final indignity came when German soldiers, too weak to defend themselves, were reduced to trading personal possessions for scraps of food from Soviet civilians who emerged from hiding places throughout the ruins. Men who had entered Russia as conquerors now begged for bread crusts from the same population they had terrorized during the summer offensive. Their roles completely reversed by the mathematics of starvation and the simple reality that survival trumped ideology when death approached. The Sixth Army, that had once epitomized German military efficiency, became a shambling horde of living skeletons who could no longer maintain military discipline because the energy required for proper behavior exceeded their caloric intake. Unit formation became impossible as soldiers collapsed during marching attempts, leaving behind comrades who lacked the strength to carry wounded men, or even to bury the dead who accumulated in frozen piles throughout their defensive positions. The transformation was so complete that many German survivors later reported they could no longer recognize their own comrades, as extreme weight loss and disease had altered familiar faces beyond recognition. The human cost of Hitler's obsession with symbolic victory had reduced an entire army to a collection of dying strangers who shared only their common fate, and their inability to comprehend how the most powerful military force in European history had been reduced to such elemental misery in the span of a few winter months. Friedrich Paulus huddled in the fetid basement of the Univermag department store like a cornered animal, his gaunt frame racked by nervous tics that had transformed the left side of his face into a grotesque mask of involuntary spasms, while the sound of Soviet artillery drew ever closer to his final refuge. The once proud general who had commanded the Wehrmacht's most elite army now resembled a broken scarecrow, his uniform hanging loose on a body that had lost 40 pounds during the siege, while dysentery ravaged his digestive system and left him weakened to the point of collapse. The basement headquarters had become a nightmare of human waste and desperation, where excrement piled waist-high against the walls because soldiers lacked the strength to dispose of it properly, while the stench of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and human filth created an atmosphere so toxic that Soviet officers would later describe it as worse than anything they had encountered in years of brutal warfare. Major Anatoly Soldatov noted that the conditions were so revolting that visitors could barely force themselves through the front or back doors, where accumulated waste blocked normal passage and created a health hazard that defied military sanitation standards. The transformation of Paulus from confident army commander to broken invalid represented the complete collapse of German military leadership under impossible circumstances. As the nervous breakdown that had begun with minor facial twitches in December had progressed to violent spasms that rendered him nearly incapable of coherent communication. The stress of watching his army slowly die while receiving increasingly irrational orders from Hitler had pushed the field marshal beyond the limits of psychological endurance, creating a human wreck who bore no resemblance to the officer who had led 250,000 men into the city 6 months earlier. Hitler's promotion of Paulus to field marshal on January 30th, 1943, represented the final act of cynical manipulation by a leader who preferred symbolic gestures to practical solutions for military disasters. The promotion came with an implicit order for suicide, as Hitler reminded his staff that no German field marshal had ever been captured alive, making his expectation clear that Paulus should take his own life, rather than face the humiliation of surrender and provide the enemy with a propaganda victory. Paulus received the news of his promotion while lying on a makeshift bed in the basement, his face covered with 2 weeks of beard stubble, and his eyes reflecting the hollow stare of a man who had lost all hope for survival or victory. Colonel Wilhelm Adam, his aide-de-camp, recorded the moment when headquarters staff delivered Hitler's message, noting that Paulus immediately recognized the promotion as an invitation to commit suicide rather than any genuine recognition of military achievement. The field marshal's rejection of suicide reflected both his Roman Catholic faith and his growing disillusionment with Hitler's leadership, as he told subordinates that he had no intention of shooting himself for what he dismissed as a Bohemian corporal who had sacrificed an entire army for symbolic purposes. His decision to live represented a final act of defiance against a regime that had reduced him to commanding an army of walking corpses in conditions that violated every principle of military science and human decency. Soviet forces had offered generous surrender terms through General Konstantin Rokossovsky on January 7, 1943, promising normal rations, medical treatment for the wounded, permission to retain uniforms and personal effects, and repatriation to any country after the war. The humane terms stood in stark contrast to the death sentence that continued resistance represented, yet Hitler rejected Paulus's request for permission to surrender with the categorical statement that capitulation was out of the question, because every day the army held out longer helped the whole front. The final Soviet assault on January 31st trapped Paulus in his basement headquarters as units of the 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade surrounded the Univermag building and sealed off all escape routes. The sound of Soviet machine guns and mortars grew closer throughout the early morning hours until white flags appeared from the ground and upper floors, signaling the end of organized resistance in the southern pocket of German forces. Senior Lieutenant Fyodor Ilchenko led the Soviet negotiating party into the basement at approximately 7:35 a.m., discovering a scene that defied military convention as the commanding general of an entire army surrendered, while lying on a bed in conditions that resembled a sewer more than a military headquarters. The contrast between the dignity that military protocol demanded and the squalid reality of the basement's surrender created a moment that captured the complete degradation of German military power on the Eastern Front. Paulus greeted his captors in broken Russian with the formal statement that the field marshal of the German army rendered himself prisoner to the Red Army, apologizing that his new uniform was not ready because the promotion had been conferred only the day before. His wry observation that the uniform would hardly be useful to him now revealed the bitter irony of Hitler's final gesture toward an army that had been abandoned to its fate months earlier. The surrender negotiations required Paulus to formally capitulate the southern pocket, while acknowledging that he could not order the northern German forces to surrender because their commander, Colonel General Karl Strecker, reported directly to Hitler after January 30th. This division of authority reflected the complete breakdown of military command structure, as the pocket fragmented into isolated units that could no longer coordinate their actions or maintain unified resistance. Paulus demanded guarantees for his personal safety before agreeing to leave the basement, a request that highlighted his awareness that captured German commanders faced uncertain treatment from Soviet forces who had witnessed years of Wehrmacht atrocities on Soviet territory. The formal courtesies extended to a defeated enemy reflected Soviet confidence in victory rather than any obligation to observe traditional military protocol toward an army that had committed extensive war crimes during its advance. The statistics of surrender revealed the catastrophic scale of German defeat at Stalingrad, where 91,000 skeletal survivors emerged from basements and bunkers to enter Soviet captivity, while 250,000 German and Romanian corpses lay frozen throughout the ruins. Hitler's refusal to authorize retreat or surrender had cost the Wehrmacht 22 divisions, totaling 300,000 irreplaceable trained soldiers, representing the largest military disaster in German history. The Sixth Army, that had numbered 265,000 men in November 1942, was reduced to fewer than 5,000 effective soldiers by January 1943, with the remainder either dead, wounded, or too weak to continue fighting. Only 6,000 German prisoners would survive Soviet captivity to return home after the war, representing a 93% mortality rate that made surrender nearly equivalent to a death sentence for most of the captured army. The collapse of the Sixth Army represented far more than a tactical defeat, as the destruction of an entire field army marked the beginning of Germany's strategic retreat on the Eastern Front, and demonstrated that Hitler's war machine had finally encountered an enemy it could not defeat through superior tactics, equipment, or training. The surrender at Stalingrad destroyed the myth of German invincibility that had sustained Nazi expansion since 1939, providing the Soviet Union with a propaganda victory that matched its military triumph and marked the turning point in the European war. Paulus himself became a symbol of German military failure, transitioning from a respected staff officer who had helped plan Operation Barbarossa to a broken field marshal whose surrender represented the end of German offensive capability on the Eastern Front. His capture provided the Soviets with the highest-ranking German officer taken during the war and created a propaganda asset that would prove invaluable in undermining German morale and encouraging additional surrenders as the Wehrmacht faced the prospect of inevitable defeat. 91,000 German prisoners stumbled from the frozen ruins of Stalingrad into Soviet captivity, beginning a death march that would claim more lives than the final battle itself, while transforming the survivors into living ghosts who bore witness to the ultimate price of Hitler's hubris. These skeletal remnants of the once mighty Sixth Army faced a journey into oblivion that would prove more merciless than the siege they had endured, as Soviet guards herded them through the wasteland of their own making toward camps that offered little hope for survival. The march to Beketovka camp became a procession of the damned, as prisoners too weak to walk were shot by their escorts or simply left to freeze beside the road where their corpses joined the thousands of German dead that littered the approaches to Stalingrad. Soviet civilians pressed into service as burial parties stacked the frozen bodies like cordwood at roadside collection points, using improvised sleds and handcarts to transport the accumulating dead to mass graves that had been hastily dug in the frozen earth. The survivors who reached Beketovka found conditions that mocked any pretense of adherence to international law regarding prisoner treatment, as wooden barracks designed for a few hundred men were packed with 40 to 50 prisoners each, creating human sardine cans where diseases spread with lethal efficiency through populations already weakened beyond endurance. An Austrian doctor noted his first impression of the camp as a landscape of death where nothing existed to eat or drink except filthy snow and urine-yellow ice that provided the only relief for unbearable thirst. The daily routine at Beketovka centered around the systematic collection of corpses. As prisoners who died during the night were laid outside the barracks each morning to be added to an ever-extending line of naked, frozen bodies that grew into what one doctor estimated as a mountain of corpses, approximately 100 yards long and 6 feet high. The mortality statistics became so overwhelming that Soviet authorities lost count of individual deaths, simply recording the daily toll that averaged 50 to 60 men per day during the peak winter months. The Soviet camp administration had been utterly unprepared for the sudden influx of such massive numbers of prisoners, possessing no motor transport and barely enough resources to provide even minimal sustenance for populations that numbered in the tens of thousands. Water arrived sporadically in iron barrels towed by camels, while food consisted of bran soup that provided insufficient calories to sustain men who were already suffering from advanced starvation and exposure-related injuries. German prisoners assigned to burial details found themselves in the grotesque position of disposing of their own dead comrades, using human-powered carts because no horses or motorized vehicles were available for the endless task of corpse removal. Almost all members of these burial parties soon died of typhus, which spread through the camps like wildfire among populations whose immune systems had been destroyed by months of malnutrition and stress. The transportation of prisoners from Beketovka to permanent camps in Siberia created additional opportunities for mass death, as railway wagons designed for cargo were packed with up to 100 men each, with only a single hole in the floor serving as a latrine for the entire car. The combination of overcrowding, inadequate ventilation, and sub-zero temperatures created conditions where prisoners died so quietly that their comrades often did not realize death had occurred until hours later, leading to the systematic stacking of corpses by the wagon doors for removal at stops. Thirst became the dominant form of suffering during transport, as prisoners received dried bread and salt fish but minimal water, driving desperate men to lick frozen condensation from metal surfaces inside the wagons, or consume handfuls of snow during brief stops. Many prisoners died from the shock of eating snow, their weakened digestive systems unable to process the sudden influx of cold water that further depleted their remaining body heat. The mortality rate among Stalingrad prisoners reached catastrophic proportions that defied comparison with other prisoner populations, as an estimated 85,000 of the 91,000 captured Germans died within the first few months of captivity. The death toll included approximately 45,200 confirmed deaths at Beketovka alone by October 1943, representing a mortality rate that exceeded 90% and made survival the exception, rather than the rule for men who had surrendered expecting to live. Camp records revealed the comprehensive medical collapse of the prisoner population, with 70% suffering from severe dystrophy, 100% showing signs of vitamin deficiency diseases, 60% affected by various degrees of frostbite, and virtually all prisoners displaying symptoms of mental and physical exhaustion that rendered them incapable of productive work or normal human function. The 10% mortality rate during processing meant that 1 in 10 prisoners died before camp authorities could even complete their initial registration. The survivors who endured the initial death camps faced years of forced labor in conditions that continued to claim lives through systematic undernourishment and brutal working conditions. Soviet authorities treated German prisoners as expendable resources whose labor could be exploited without regard for basic human survival needs, creating a system where productivity quotas took precedence over prisoner welfare and medical care remained virtually non-existent. The death register at Beketovka alone recorded 45,200 confirmed prisoner deaths by October 1943, with daily mortality rates averaging 50 to 60 men during peak winter periods. Soviet burial parties used 3,500 civilians and 1,200 German prisoners to dispose of corpses that accumulated faster than graves could be dug in the frozen ground. Transport to Siberian camps killed an estimated 40,000 additional prisoners during the journey, with railway wagons designed for 40 men packed with 100 prisoners each. The final survival rate among Stalingrad prisoners reached an unprecedented low of 6,000 men from an original 91,000 captured, representing a mortality rate of 93% that exceeded death rates in Nazi concentration camps. Medical examinations revealed that 40,000 prisoners required immediate hospitalization upon capture, with 100% suffering from malnutrition-related diseases and 60% showing severe frostbite damage. The few thousand German prisoners who survived the initial camps faced years of additional hardship in Siberian labor camps, where they were forced to work as slave laborers in coal mines, timber operations, and construction projects that continued to claim lives through industrial accidents and continued malnutrition. The survivors became walking testimonies to human endurance under impossible conditions, their experiences representing the ultimate consequence of a war that had consumed millions of lives while achieving nothing beyond mutual destruction. The systematic dehumanization of German prisoners reflected the broader brutality that had characterized the entire Eastern Front campaign. Where both sides had abandoned conventional rules of warfare in favor of total war that recognized no limits on the treatment of enemy soldiers or civilians. The death camps and brutal marches that claimed the lives of Stalingrad prisoners represented the final chapter in a conflict that had reduced warfare to its most primitive and merciless form. The irony of German soldiers dying in conditions that mirrored those they had imposed on Soviet prisoners earlier in the war was not lost on either the survivors or their captors, as the Wehrmacht troops who had participated in or witnessed the starvation of millions of Soviet prisoners now experienced similar treatment from an enemy that had learned the German lessons in systematic brutality all too well. The march into oblivion that claimed 85,000 German lives represented more than military defeat or even criminal justice, as it demonstrated the complete collapse of any moral framework that might have governed the conduct of war between civilized nations. The survivors who eventually returned to Germany carried with them not only the physical scars of their ordeal, but the psychological burden of witnessing the complete breakdown of human civilization in the face of total war. The fate of the German prisoners from Stalingrad became a cautionary tale about the ultimate consequences of aggressive war and racial ideology, as the soldiers who had marched east as representatives of a master race returned home as broken men whose experiences testified to the fundamental equality of human suffering, regardless of nationality or ideology. Their ordeal represented the final payment extracted by a war that had consumed the civilization that created it.